Now that we've concluded discussing the French Revolution, we need to talk about the Industrial Revolution, which begins in Great Britain at about the same time as the American Revolution and the French Revolution are going on politically. The Industrial Revolution begins in Great Britain in about 1780, and today we're going to explore what the origins or what the causes of the Industrial Revolution in Britain were and how did it develop until about 1850. Now, Great Britain was responsible for pioneering new technology and a new urban society. Remember, prior to about the 18th century, we were predominantly agricultural. Throughout the 18th century, we became increasingly urban. Okay, remember that little French Revolution that's going on. Of course, Great Britain is helping to fight against the French revolutionaries, and that will create a high demand for stuff to be produced. And then finally, Great Britain was the trailblazer of economic development, largely because of its stable government. Now, the 18th century origins of the Industrial Revolution, which help us answer our guiding question, is that Atlantic trade really provided a large market for British manufactured goods. There's this group of about 13 colonies, I don't know if you've heard of them, over in what's now the United States of America, was forced to purchase British manufactured goods because they were colonies. So until 1776, Britain had a constant market in the West, and also, of course, in India and the other places that Britain had colonized were forced to buy their goods. Also, they were in high demand on continental Europe. Britain made good stuff. This led to canal building to facilitate transportation. Agricultural technology led to high supplies of food at low prices. Remember that the population was increasing because the death rate decreased. Basically, people had more spending money and they wanted to buy more stuff. When people want to buy more stuff, more people want to make it, and that opened up new markets. Finally, we have the infrastructure for industrialization. Infrastructure just means having what is necessary within your society to make industrialization or anything else possible. Examples of the infrastructure, they had a central bank in Great Britain, they had credit markets, a stable government, which is key, and rural proletarians, rural poor workers. Why were there all of these rural poor workers looking for work? Do you guys remember the Enclosure Act? Oh, so all these people got kicked off their land and they're like, shucks, we need to go find a job. Hey, there's all these new industries opening up. We should totally go work there. And this is what it looked like. This is a painting that sort of indicates what industrialization, the transfer to industrialization may have looked like in Great Britain in about this, this is probably getting into the 19th century at this point. This, by the way, is coal burning. So the first factories were based on the 18th century putting out system. Don't get excited. All that means is the merchant capitalists, remember, were paying people in the cottage industry to create goods, finished products, and then the merchant capitalists would take those finished products and put them out, they'd sell them to people for a profit. So that is the putting out system. People were making a lot of money, and they were like, hey, we should find cheaper and quicker ways to do this. We could make even more money. So around 1765, this innovative man named James Hargreaves invented what's called the spinning jenny. The spinning jenny was very efficient, and it eliminated shortages of thread, which was holding back the textile industry. The textile industry is where it all starts. Textiles are just clothing, cloth material, and everybody needs pants, right? So the textile industry really took off, and the spinning jenny made it quicker, easier, and more cheap, basically, to produce quantities of fabric. Okay. This is an immediately huge impact for the working poor. Believe it or not, up until the 19th century, underwear and, just stuff that we take for granted was a luxury because, cloth is expensive until about now in history, and so you can't waste it on underwear. So the working poor, for the first time, were like, sweet, we have boxer shorts, all right. I don't know if they were boxer shorts, but, this really was, if you read in your McKay, they make a big deal about this. This was a very immediate an important impact on the lower class in society. Cheap cloth, cheap textiles. Weavers were highly paid until about 1800. Well, I wonder why. We'll talk about that in a moment. There was, unfortunately, an exploitation then of parentless children, also known as orphans. These children were largely working in early factories, and they were paid almost nothing. They worked a ridiculous amount of hours a day. They got Sundays off, and they started at about 14 years old. This will be reformed later, okay, but we're not quite there yet in 1800. Well, weavers, why weren't they paid high after 1800? Think about why they would be paid less if technology like the spinning jenny made textiles easier to obtain and cheaper to obtain. Okay, we'll talk about that in class. So what's the big deal about this? These first factories, these very first textile factories, starting with the spinning jenny, is marks the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Here you can see what the spinning jenny looked like. On the right, just getting on the left over here, and on the right, you can see how later on these factories would be produced mostly by water, because initially they ran on water power, which we'll talk about next. The problem of energy. Well, why couldn't factories continue to rely on water power? Perhaps you guys have images from like the Middle Ages with like the huge windmills with the huge water wheels. I mean, it was working fine throughout history. Why not now? Water mills were used throughout the Middle Ages and into our more modern period in the 16th and 17th centuries to grind grain, okay, to produce bread, because that's all we really want, right, is bread. Windmills were used to pump the water. Well, lack of energy was the root of poverty, because, you know, if there is not a source of water near you, you don't have quick and easy access to grain, which means you don't have quick and easy access to food. Wood is also becoming scarce, you know, because you can only chop down so many trees before you start to run out, okay? Coal and pig iron were stagnant because of a lack of wood. Well, what is that? Pig iron was an easy, cheap way to produce, iron, and it was done by burning stuff, okay? And if you have a lack of wood, it's hard to burn stuff. So you can see why these might be inefficient. You can't exactly plug one of these in and put it in your backyard. Okay, you have to have a water source or a great supply of wood or a big open field to run your windmill on. That's exactly why windmills are kind of inefficient today. That's why we don't all have wind power yet. So here we go, the steam engine breakthrough. Okay, we can't use coal, the pig iron thing isn't working out, we're running out of wood, this is very inefficient. So my friend and yours, James Watt, okay, decides to take an existing model of a steam engine and improve it in 1769. By the 1780s, just hardly, 20 years later, no, 20, I can't count, sorry, 10 years later or so, it's in wide popular use. Well, so what? This is the first time in history that human beings had almost unlimited power, okay? Also, abundance, basically like living more than like 5 inches away from death, was now possible for ordinary people. Steam was able to replace water and wind power in textile industries, and as well as flour and malt mills, okay, like food, okay, and it improved the process of making iron. Well, as iron becomes more readily available, it becomes cheap, and then it's going to improve the standard of living, and it's going to spur on other industries. So here's some cool shiny stuff. These are different models of steam engines, okay, throughout history. This one's all nice and shiny. I like this one, but these are what James Watt invented. These are steam engines. So think about the advantages and disadvantages of this. A steam engine is obviously made out of metal. It's nice and, it's kind of big, but it's not nearly as big as a water wheel. Okay, we can kind of maybe discuss this more in class. That's going to lead us to the railroads, okay? So we went from wood and water and wind power to steam engines. All of a sudden we have all this abundance of energy, and that's going to lead to locomotion, also known as railroads. So, although roads improved for passenger traffic, international infrastructure was still difficult. That means that there was not a lot of easy ways, or I should say there were not a lot of easy ways to transport goods. So this guy named George Stephenson built the very first locomotive after 10 years of experimentation, and it was called the Rocket. It traveled 16 miles per hour on rails between Liverpool and Manchester. I won't ever do that again, sorry. Okay, so it's significant. So what? Well, first of all, it reduces the cost and the uncertainty of shipping over land. It widely increased market size. It encouraged larger factories with better technology. It was like, oh, dude, we can sell more stuff. We got to make more stuff. We need a bigger factory. Woot! Okay, it hurt local artisans because now, like, mom and pop stores are like, oh, we can't keep up with this. Okay, it increased the demand for unskilled labor. Again, the Enclosure Act, we have lots of unskilled labor to go work in these factories, and now we need more of them. It even impacted art. Okay, Monet and Turner, painters, incorporated railroads into their artistic productions. It even changed our sense of time. What used to take months and weeks could now take days, even hours. Pretty hardcore. This is right here, the very first locomotive. And here's a model of the very first locomotive in, I don't know what museum this is, but it's in Great Britain. Okay, industry and population. Okay, this is really cool. By 1851, they had this great exhibition in Great Britain to show off basically to the rest of continental Europe how awesome they were. And they made this crystal palace out of just glass and iron. It sort of landmarked Britain as the very first industrial nation, and the British gross national product, GNP, quadrupled in less than 100 years. So basically, everybody's, well, not everybody, everybody asterisk, okay, except for like the really, really, really working poor, their standard of living is skyrocketing compared to what's going on in the rest of Europe. We'll talk about this in class, the dismal science of population, because population is increasing. People like Thomas Malthus and David Ricardo, sociologists, wrote about population and extinction. Thomas Malthus wrote the essay on the principle of population just before 1800, and he said that population will always grow faster than the food supply. Any of you who have taken an ecology class are very familiar with this idea. David Ricardo came up with the iron law of wages, that wages would stay at subsistence level, that basically the working poor would never make enough money to increase their standard of living because there were just too many of them. There was a tendency then for the rich to get richer while the poor got even poorer, which we'll talk about extensively in class, so I'm not going to belabor that point. These are pictures and images of the Crystal Palace in Great Britain, which is where the exhibition of 1851 was held. So let's answer a question. What were the origins of the Industrial Revolution in Britain, and how did it develop between 1780 and 1850? Well, the origins were certainly in the Atlantic trade economy, new agricultural technology, stuff we talked about already, infrastructure for industrialization, you remember like the banks and the creditors, the Enclosure Act, right? Because the Enclosure Act provides all this cheap labor, the putting out system, having a market basically for finished products, and the developments for the spinning jenny, making the textile industry basically erupt, the water frame, which you read about in your text, the growth of factories, the steam engine, which then spurs on all of this production because it's cheap, accessible energy, which leads us to the railroad, and that's all I have for you today. Enjoy and have a wonderful evening.